Hi everyone, I'm going to speak about the future of API management in this talk. I am Denis Jannot, Director of Field Engineering at Solo.io, based in Paris. So Solo is a company that is based in Cambridge in the US. We are a software company, and what we do is that we take the best of some popular open source technology like Envoy, Istio, Cilium, and so on. And we create like a software stack that people can consume to expose and connect services securely in a modern way with everything as code and so on. We have customers in many different vertical. We are well funded and growing. So you've probably already seen this post from Mark O'Neill about the end of full lifecycle API management. There are a few takeaways from this, right? The first one is that in the past, people were looking for solutions that manage everything, like from designing your API, testing your API, exposing your API securely, cataloging that in an API portal, and so on. But now they are more looking at combining different tools, some open source software, some provided by vendors, to get the best of all these different solutions and to be able to create their own API management stack. And that gives people a lot more freedom, because when they want to change their just their API gateway, they can keep their existing developer portal, or when they want to change the way they develop and test APIs, they don't need to change the developer portal or the gateway, for example. And then on the API gateway side, they are also looking at like distributing API gateways across different environments, having like more cloud native API gateways that are lightweight, simple to configure as code, and that really provide all these important features like security monitoring and traffic routing, but not have an opinionated idea about how you should manage your APIs end to end. So what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to speak about like three trends here, right? The first one is what has been called the great unbundling. And it's kind of this idea that I just described of like not having one big stack that cover everything, but taking the best of each technology. The other trend is really having everything as code. So not only treating your application code as, you know, storing this code in a GitHub repo and then having pull requests and all these reviews and so on, doing that not only for your application code, but for everything, right? For your infrastructure, for the way you deploy this software, for the way you expose the software, the API, sorry, for the way you secure the API and so on. So really being able to do everything as code. And the last topic is going to be really like about this every direction. So it's not only about securing the north-south traffic, because in the past, when you had only monolith application, you would just care about how do I expose the API that this monolith application has to the outside world. So it's just north-south communication. But now we split this monolith into multiple microservices, and each microservice is providing a part of an API, but these microservices also talk together. And that means that we also need now to observe and connect and secure the communication between these services. That's what we call like the east-west communications. So if we start with this great unbundling, that's what I was describing before, right? Instead of having like a full lifecycle API management stack, we separate that into multiple different areas. And here I'm going to just focus on the developer portal and the API gateway. But there is also all these other steps like API design, API testing, and so on. But because at Solo, we are not really offering anything in this API design and testing, I'm focusing on these two aspects, which are like the developer portal and the API gateway. And what we show here is that for the API gateway, there are like a set of capabilities that people expect, like having the ability to configure it as code, to be able to comply with, a GitOps approach, being able to authenticate the API call with API keys or JOT tokens, being able to apply some rate limits, being able to expose not only REST APIs, but also GraphQL API or gRPC-based API and so on, right? So that's the type of capabilities they are looking for their API gateway. And for the developer portal, it really depends on where they are, right? If they already have a developer portal and the front end is good and their users are happy with it, they probably don't want to change the front end itself, but they may want to change the back end of it, right? They may want to have like a way to configure the API product in a more modern way using like the same approach as everything as code, right? So generally, you have like multiple microservices that provide multiple different APIs. There is often a lack of consistency. So what you want is create an API product that is the user side of your API that looks very nice and smart with all the paths that follow a standard and so on. And then you want to rewrite the path to send the call to the right path for the different APIs, right? So traditionally, you would use like some tooling that are allowing you to configure this API product or to build this API product based on the UI, for example. But that means that it's very difficult to follow what changes are made or to have like an approval process. So you may want to have like a more modern API developer portal backend that allows you to define all these things as code, to have like pull requests and what we just discussed before, and I'm going to dive into in the next slide, but keep your front end. Or you may also be in a situation where you don't have a developer portal today, right? And in that case, you want a solution that gives you both the backend and the front end. But in that case, you really want a front end that is flexible. In the past, people, like some software vendors were giving you like a developer portal that were it's something you can customize, but just a little bit. Like you can put your logo, you can change a little bit the CSS styling, but every time you need to do something different, you need really to talk with the vendor and get some changes made, right? What people want now, if they start from scratch, is to get like a front end that they can really customize. And at the same time, it's not only about like how you expose your APIs externally. It's also about how you expose and catalog them internally, right? And in that case, you may use the same developer portal, but if you have started to adopt tooling like Backstage, where you want to manage in Backstage like the full life cycle of your APIs, you may also want to catalog this API directly in Backstage, right? So that's where also it's important to have like the ability to decouple this developer portal backend and developer portal frontend. So, right? Having a developer portal backend that Backstage can call to then display the APIs natively in Backstage. So the second thing we spoke about was this everything as code, right? So again, you put your application code today, you want to make a change, you are going to submit this change into your Git repo, submit a pull request, and there will be an approval process before you can move this application in production, right? Or before you can even make any change in your code, right? And then people started to do the same for deployment, right? Instead of directly applying deployment into Kubernetes, you put the YAML either in the same repo as the application code or in another repository, and you submit that change, any change you make to this Git repo, like if you want to change the number of replicas or the name of the port or whatever, you submit that into this Git repo. You have an approval process, and then if it's approved, then you have some tooling like Argo CD or Flux that are applying this change and synchronizing this change into your Kubernetes environment. It can even be Jenkins or more standard like legacy CI/CD tooling, but the idea is the same, right? So that's kind of a standard pattern now. But what we see is that now we want to apply this pattern to everything. So we've started to see this infrastructure as code, where even the way I deploy Kubernetes itself, I want to automate it with this same GitOps flow. But what's really interesting in this world of API, right, is that we see now the same for I want to describe as code how I want to authenticate my users when I expose them my API, right? If I want to authenticate a user with API keys, right? I don't want to go in the UI and decide the rules and create the policy. Now I want to put that in the repo as well, and having that applied to my Kubernetes cluster as some Kubernetes custom resources, and then having a smart gateway that understand this and apply this rule, right? And the same even the way you can design your API, right? Instead of going into your UI and create your API product by drag and drop of different APIs and renaming the path and so on, you want now to declare that in YAML. And again, any change can be going through this approval process and be reflected at the end in your gateway or in your portal. And finally, we'll speak about this two directions, right? It's not only about north-south traffic and east-west traffic. It's really like combining both. So the one that everyone knows, right, is that you have these communications coming, or the API call coming, and you may authenticate the call directly in your service, right, in your application. If it's like an API key or Joe token or whatever, you could implement that in the application code, but obviously it's not ideal because you want the developers to focus on the implementing the business logic, not the security. And also nobody really knows how it is done, right? You have to audit the application one by one, right? So that's why people moved this responsibility to an API gateway, right? So you can use an API gateway, authenticate the API call, and then send the request to the different services. But what about the east-west, right? Like I discussed before, you have like multiple microservices, and even when an API call comes, it's very often that the service that received this call needs to talk to another service to get some additional data before it replies, right? So how do you secure this communication between the services? You can do that also in the application, but that means that, again, instead of focusing on the application or the business logic, you start to have to worry about security. And it's like really like difficult to understand how all these communication have been secured. And there is also a lack of visibility. You don't really know which microservices talk together, right? So there are like many challenges here. So for this east-west part, there is like the service mesh solution, right? Which is like really becoming the standard here, especially with Istio. That is the most popular service mesh. So the idea here is quite simple. Like you deploy this Istio, and you restart your different pods so that they become part of the mesh. And now all the communications are intercepted by the proxy that is part of this mesh. And you can have encryption by default. You can define rules that says this service can talk to this service, but not to this other service, right? So you solve this problem of securing the communication between your microservices, but you don't really solve the north-south problem, because the gateway that comes with Istio is really just a basic ingress. it doesn't have like out of the box the capability to validate API keys or being able to apply rate limiting or WAF and all these kind of capabilities, right? So that's one challenge, right? You still need to figure out how to secure this incoming traffic. You still need to figure out what will be your developer portal. It only solve your east-west problem. And also you need to get some new competencies, right? Like if you have not managed Istio before, you need to get some knowledge about how to implement it in the right way, following the best practices and so on. So how do we help at Solo? So the first thing we do is that we have this Gloo platform that is composed of multiple different layers that you can adopt in the way you want, right? So the first layer is something we call Gloo Mesh Core. And what Gloo Mesh Core is not a SaaS. It's really just like a Helm chart that you deploy in one of your cluster, like a management cluster. And then you deploy another Helm chart and all the clusters you have, and this Helm chart corresponds to this agent that's going to discover, is Istio already deployed in the cluster? If it is not deployed, it can automate the lifecycle of it. It can deploy it, following the best practice. It can simplify the way you will upgrade Istio and so on. And what it does as well is that it's gathering all information about the different services that are deployed and also the different Istio configuration you have in place, and it gives you some insights. So this insight is kind of telling you, based on all the configuration we have discovered, what could be improved or what security issues we are seeing or what configuration issues we have found, right? For example, you see here that the product page can talk to reviews V1, V2, or V3. So if you want to manage where to send the traffic to which version, you need to create a virtual service and a destination rule. And the destination rule is used to define what we call subsets. So subset V1 or subset V2 and so on. If you forget to create this destination rule, it's not going to work. But in the UI, with what we call these insights, we're going to tell you, oh, we discovered that you created this virtual service, but you didn't define the subset in any destination rule. That's an example of the type of insight you would get. But the insight would be also like telling you, can also combine even some metrics and some configuration. So we have like a lot of very smart insights that are built in. This UI also helps you to look at the life cycle of your certificates, making sure that, like, a common mistake for people who are new to Istio is to deploy Istio with the standard, command, and then they forget about it, and then after 1 year, the default certificate expire and nothing is working anymore. Now with this UI, it tells you like, oh, be careful, this is going to expire, right? So you have a lot of value that helps you to manage Istio across clusters and in a standardized way, right? It can be OpenShift in on-premise and like GKE or EKS or whatever, right? You are going to be able to manage Istio in a standardized way. The second thing we do is that we deploy this observability stack that is based on open telemetry collectors, and is going to collect the metrics for the communications inside the mesh, but also for the incoming communication. So in both directions, like north, south, and east, west. Collect all these metrics and ship these metrics into the management cluster that can then display this type of graph showing you which services are talking together, the latency, the number of errors, all these kind of things. If you are familiar with Istio and with Kali, it's similar to that, but multi-cluster. So you have a global view of how, which communications are happening. And we can even then configure the observability stack to send metrics, traces, or logs into your own observability stack that can be based on Datadog or Prometheus or Dynatrace and so on. And also with this Gloo Mesh Core component, you get like end-to-end Istio support, in the last 5 version of Istio. We backport all the potential vulnerability patch. And you may have heard about Istio ambient mesh, which is like the new option in Istio to do the same thing I have described, but without having a sidecar. We are one of the co-creators with Google of ambient mesh. We are one of the main contributors. So we also add some additional capabilities there, and we make it transparent for you to move from sidecars to no sidecar. We are also like having a lot of involvement into the Istio, but also into the Cilium community. We have like 3 of the 6 Istio TOC members. We have Louis, who is one of the co-founders of Istio, and many key contributors who are working in the company. So we spoke about East-West, right? Now let's speak about North-South. I said that the Istio gateway doesn't come with like authentication and all these kind of things, right? It's pretty basic. What we do is that we have another layer that's called Gloo Mesh Gateway. And by the way, you can use Gloo Mesh Gateway without Gloo Mesh Core, and you can really decide which components make sense for you. You can use Gloo Mesh Gateway that is based on the Istio Ingress Gateway without having the services in the mesh, right? So it's very flexible model. And what it does is we transform the Istio gateway so that it becomes a proper enterprise API gateway. So it can, authenticate code with API keys and JWT token. It can apply rate limiting. It has like a web application firewall. It can expose services that are in Kubernetes in another Kubernetes cluster or in a VM or Lambda services. It can really expose any type of service. It also can expose different REST API as a GraphQL API, so you can compose your own GraphQL API from it. So it has really many capabilities. It's really a modern cloud-native enterprise API gateway. Cloud-native because everything has code, right? Everything you configure 100% is through Kubernetes YAML. And it also includes a developer portal. And again, you may just use the API gateway without the portal. And the portal comes with this front end that you see on the bottom right. That is like an open source template that we provide to you. It's fully functional, but you can customize it as much as you want because it's just a template. And if you already have your own developer portal, you want to keep the front end, that's fine because we have decoupled these two components. And this front end is just sending code to a backend component that is part of our stack here, right? So you can keep your front end and just get information about which API should be exposed to which user based on the backend that runs in the platform. And that decoupling also allowed us to build a Backstage plugin. So if you are using Backstage internally, instead of exposing, you could say, I'm going to expose externally through a standard developer portal my APIs, but internally I want to catalog my APIs directly in Backstage so that you don't need to use multiple tools to manage the lifecycle of your applications. So that's kind of the second stack, right? So we secure the east-west, we secure the north-south, we provide this portal that is very flexible. And on top of that, we have another layer called Gloo Mesh Enterprise, which in that case, if you want like all the capability I described before for east-west, right? Having all these Istio service mesh that secure the communication between the service, the different services and so on, right? You may want to have like a simpler API to manage it, right? So that's what Gloo Mesh Enterprise provides. So it provides a simpler API with one type of custom resource for each operation. So for example, you can create a route table that say, I want to send 50% of the traffic to V1 and 50% to V2. It's going to be translated into the corresponding Istio resources. In that case, will be a virtual service plus a destination rule that define the subset for V1 and V2. So it's simpler because we have this high-level abstraction. It's multi-cluster, so you can configure how you want the policy to be applied across different clusters. And it provides multi-tenancy because we come with this concept of a workspace, so you can group together one or multiple namespaces of one or multiple clusters. And then you can define some rules, like say which services should be exported from one workspace to another. And automatically we can define all the authorization policies in Istio so that only the services that are in the same workspace can communicate together, plus the one that we have exported. For example, if I export product page to this other workspace, it will create the rule to allow the services of this workspace to be accessing this service here. So really like bringing multi-tenancy and simplifying the way you manage Istio policies across clusters, plus allowing you to very easily configure communication, the way communication occurs across clusters. So you can use an abstraction we call a virtual destination, so that when this service product page talks to reviews, it doesn't call the review service locally directly. It calls a new abstraction called reviews.global. And when this call is sent, then it's going to try to find automatically if there is a review service that runs locally. If it cannot find locally, it will try to find the closest one, right? So if it's running locally, it's fine, it's using it. If it's running locally but doesn't reply, then it's going to fail over automatically to another cluster. If I want to move this service to another cluster, it doesn't matter, it's easy because this service doesn't know where this service really runs. It just knows that there is this virtual destination. And the communication is still secured with end-to-end mutual TLS. So again, I think what that's the last slide. What I wanted to really show is, again, this idea of the great unbundling and the fact that you can just use our API gateway, you can use our developer portal, but not necessarily use our front end. You can integrate with your backstage. So we give you a lot of flexibility there, and we give you all this capability in a cloud native way where you can configure everything as code, right? The second thing, as I said, everything as code, right? That's really, you configure our platform as code. We have no database here, right? You are not configuring our platform in a UI that then writes some data in a database, right? You configure our platform completely through Kubernetes resources. We still give you a nice UI to know what's going on, but everything is configured as code, right? So that's the number 2, right? The number 3 is, like I was saying, you need to cover the north-south traffic and the east-west traffic, and that's exactly what we do, right? We give you the ability to treat both directions the same way, so you get like full visibility and security for the incoming traffic and for the traffic inside your environment. And when I say inside your environment, it's not necessarily inside one cluster. It can be one cluster in one cloud, one cluster in another cloud, and so on. So I hope you liked it. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.